Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkish Diplomacy. On today's episode, we'll be discussing Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's visit to the TRNC, where Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus marked the 51st anniversary of the peace operations. We'll also discuss the war in Ukraine and the latest developments from the occupied Gaza Strip. Joining me on today's program are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar and Mideast political analyst Dr. Abdunur Tumi.
Anavatan Türkiye ile Kuzey Kıbrıs Türk Cumhuriyeti geçmişte nasıl omuz omuzaysa bugün de aynı azimle aynı istikamette yürümeye devam ediyor. Zorlukları birlikte göğüslüyoruz. Ambargoları birlikte aşıyoruz. Geleceğimizi birlikte inşa ediyoruz.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan paid an official visit to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus on Sunday. President Erdoğan and his Turkish Cypriot counterpart Ersin Tatar participated in the celebrations to mark the 51st anniversary of Turkey's military operation launched to protect the Turkish population on Cyprus Island.
51 yıl önce bugün şanlı Türk ordusu, kahraman mücahitler ve Kıbrıslı kardeşlerimizle birlikte Anews hayali kuranları hüsrana uğratmıştır. Adaya barış ve huzur gelmiştir. Kıbrıs Barış Harekatı'nda Mehmetçiğin adaya ayak basmasıyla Kıbrıs Türk'ünün yalnız olmadığını tüm dünya görmüştür.
Turkey has deep-rooted political, economic, military, and cultural relations with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Due to its historical and cultural bonds, Turkey attaches utmost importance to the security and welfare of the Turkish Cypriot people.
Kıbrıs Türklerinin kaybedecek bir 60 yılı daha yok. Tüketilmiş federasyon modeline dayanan Birleşmiş Milletler parametreleriyle vakit kaybedemeyiz. Kıbrıs Türk tarafının desteğini açıkça çektiği birçok kez denenmiş ve başarısız olmuş bir çözüm modelinde ısrarcı olmanın kimseye bir faydası bulunmuyor.
Turkey has called on the international community to reaffirm the sovereign equality and equal international status of the Turkish Cypriot people. Turkey, as a guarantor country, has pledged to take necessary steps for the existence, security, and sovereignty of the Turkish Cypriots by all means in line with its legal and historical responsibilities.
Uluslararası toplum, Kuzey Kıbrıs Türk Cumhuriyeti'ni tanımalı, diplomatik, siyasi ve ekonomik ilişkileri bir an önce kurmalıdır. Doğrudan uçuşların ve ticaretin önü açılmalıdır. Bugün gelinen noktada ne mutlu ki Kuzey Kıbrıs Türk Cumhuriyeti'nin uluslararası alanda görünürlüğü her geçen gün artıyor.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa Kocakenar, Anews editor. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Umar.
Mustafa, let's start with Turkish President Erdoğan's visit to the TRNC. Now, how important was this for the TRNC's sovereignty, Mustafa? Because we've been seeing some problems in the recent past few months. Tell me more about this, Mustafa.
Umar, first of all, I would like to wish Allah's mercy upon Turkish soldiers and Turkish Cypriot Mujahideen who lost their lives during Turkey's Cyprus peace operation on the island. We know that 51 years ago, Turkish armed forces conducted Cyprus peace operation on the island to protect the Turkish Cypriots from the Greek atrocities. And Turkey's Cyprus peace operation paved way for the establishment of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983. And since then, Turkey and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus have been remaining united in facing internal and external security challenges. And within this context, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan paid an official visit to the TRNC to celebrate the 51st anniversary of the Turkey's Cyprus peace operation. He met with his Turkish Cypriot counterpart Ersin Tatar to discuss the bilateral relationships between Turkey and TRNC and exchange views on the regional and international security challenges. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan reiterated Turkey's strong support for Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus territorial integrity and political sovereignty in the Eastern Mediterranean. President Erdoğan is calling upon the international community to recognize the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus and to accept the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the island. Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar also praised Turkey's strong support for the Turkish Cypriot people. On the other hand, Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the island. Within this context, Turkey is calling upon its Turkic allies to recognize the TRNC. Azerbaijan and other Turkic countries are determined to strengthen their bilateral ties with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but we know that no one except Turkey is recognizing the TRNC as a state right now. As you know, one nation, two states motto is defining the strategic cooperation between Turkey and Azerbaijan. On the other hand, Pakistan is joining the strong cooperation between Turkey and Azerbaijan in the international stage right now. I think that Turkey's allies will take new steps in terms of recognizing the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as a state.
Mustafa, how far are we from a two-state solution? Because the Turkish Cypriot leader Ersin Tatar met his Greek Cypriot counterpart in New York at the UN, and they were discussing, although there were no concrete decisions that were made that came out of that meeting. But how far are we, Mustafa, from a two-state solution? Because this is what Turkey has said as well, and Ersin Tatar has reiterated on a number of occasions. Where do we stand at this point?
As you mentioned, last week, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres hosted informal talks between Turkish and Greek Cypriots to discuss what can be done in terms of contributing to confidence-building measures between two sides living on the island. On the other hand, the Turkish, Greek and British delegations also represented their nations in these informal talks as a guarantor countries. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan also met with Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar. They discussed the possible steps in terms of bringing long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility to the Cyprus island. And we know that Turkish Cypriots and Turkey has been always calling for two-state solution to the decades-old Cyprus issue. On the other hand, Greek Cypriots and Greek sides are pushing for federalism on the island. But we know that historical process clearly showed that federalism didn't work on the island, and we know that it will not work on the island in the future. Within this context, Turkey and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus have been always calling for a two-state solution to the Cyprus issue. Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar reiterates at every opportunity that right now there are two different nations living on the island, and one nation is the Turkish Cypriot and the other nation is the Greek Cypriots. I think that Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus will be determined to convince the international community of recognizing the solutions based on the realities on the ground.
Mustafa, let's move our discussions to the war in Ukraine. Now, the United Nations has said that over 130 people have been killed. Today is the 21st of July. In the 21 days, 139 civilians have been killed by Russian forces. And now President Zelensky has also said that negotiations to achieve a ceasefire must continue, and he is pressuring the West and European countries to bring Russia to the negotiating table. Now, Musa, at where are we in this war? Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk have been attacked. These are two main areas which have been attacked by Russian forces. Where do we stand, Mustafa?
Omar, we know that the ongoing conflicts between Ukraine and Russia in Eastern Europe are raging on right now. We know that Russia is continuing to take aim at Ukraine's military infrastructure. On the other hand, Ukrainians are also trying to defend their country from the Russian aggression. On the other hand, diplomatic activities are continuing between regional and international stakeholders. As you know, last week, U.S. President Donald Trump decided to send Patriot missile systems to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression. On the other hand, Kremlin warned that this decision will prolong the war between Ukraine and Russia in the Eastern Europe. We know that Trump administration has been always calling for cessation of wars and immediate ceasefire between two warring sides in the region. But we know that there are several demands coming from both sides in terms of reaching a ceasefire or a peace deal. We know that Russia is calling upon Ukraine to give up its political sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Ukrainian side is asking for full withdrawal of Russian sources from the occupied Ukrainian territories. I think that these different security demands need to be reconciled by the international and regional stakeholders, and it is up to Turkey right now to facilitate or mediate the diplomatic talks between Ukrainians and Russians. We know that Istanbul hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in May and in June, and right now Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reaffirmed his country's determination to continue to diplomatic talks. We know that Russia is also eager to hold peace talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. I think that this week or next week we will see another round of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in Turkey's Istanbul or Ankara. But we know that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy to discuss possible terms for ceasefire or peace deal. But we know that Putin is hesitating to participate in the leader-to-leader diplomatic talks in Turkey. I think Turkish decision makers have been trying to bring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, and U.S. President Donald Trump together in Turkey to reach sustainable peace deal. I think that Turkey's diplomatic actions and initiatives will be expected to yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-standing and sustainable peace in Eastern Europe.
Musa, do you think that the recent developments that we've seen, do you think that they're moving in Ukraine's favor? Because now we have the Patriot missile defense systems, we have $40 billion from NATO, then there are personal assurances as well from the American leader Donald Trump and other European leaders. Do you think that this is these developments are favoring the Ukrainian side at this point?
Omar, during his presidential campaign, Donald Trump promised to end war between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. And he started his second term as president at the White House in January. And right now we are in July. It has passed 6 months and the war is still continuing. And it is crystal clear that Trump failed to promise his foreign policy goal during his presidential campaign. And we know that at the end of February, Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance, diplomatically humiliated Volodymyr Zelensky in front of the international media. And United States also decided to stop military support for Ukraine. And it sparked fears among European allies in terms of American security commitment to Europe. But we know that last week, Trump administration shifted its foreign policy goal towards Russia-Ukraine war. I think that Trump learned something from crisis between Iran and Israel. We know that last month Israel launched unprecedented strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and oil refineries. United States also joined Israel's military campaign against Iran in terms of obliterating Iranian nuclear problem. And I think that Trump learned something from that crisis, because America's military operation paved the way for a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. I think right now Trump is pushing for escalation, for de-escalation between Ukraine and Russia. As we mentioned, that Trump decided to send Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. On the other hand, he is also threatening to impose tariffs and sanctions on Russia and Russia's partners. I think Trump is trying to convince Putin of returning to negotiating table to strike a ceasefire deal or peace deal. I think that the next months will be decisive in terms of ending war between Ukraine and Russia in the Eastern Europe.
Mustafa, we've been talking about ceasefires, negotiations, mediation deals, and wars and conflicts. Now, there's another meeting that Istanbul is going to host on Friday, this Friday, on the 25th of July, and that's nuclear negotiations revolving around Iran and what the latest developments are. Well, so how are you looking at those negotiations, and what do you think could be an outcome of those talks?
Well, as you mentioned, Iran is set to host a new round of nuclear talks with European nations, and Turkey's financial and cultural capital, Istanbul, will welcome Iranian and European delegations to discuss the possible terms in terms of reaching a new nuclear deal between Iran and the United States. We know that since his first presidency, Donald Trump has been imposing sanctions and has been pursuing a tough military stance and tough political stance against Iran. He is always in favor of maximum pressure campaign against Iran in terms of reaching new nuclear deal. We know that Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, and he is always criticizing Obama administration's dialogue with Iran. And as we also mentioned, that Israel and United States conducted military operations against Iran's nuclear facilities to obliterate its nuclear program. We know that before the military actions against Iran's nuclear program, United States and Iran held several rounds of peace negotiations. But right now, Israel is being accused of obstructing any peace negotiations between United States and Iran in terms of discussing possible terms for a new nuclear deal. On the other hand, we know that Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Iran and the Western countries in many fields, ranging from politics and economy to trade and military. And Turkey, I think, is eager to play an important role as facilitator or mediator country to accelerate diplomatic efforts and negotiations between Iran and the United States. I think that this week's talks between Iran and European nations will be a blueprint for reaching new nuclear deal between Washington and Tehran.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you. Celebrations to mark the 51st anniversary of Turkey's military operation launched to protect the Turkish population on Cyprus Island are underway across the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus.
Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus marked the 51st anniversary of the Turkish Armed Forces peace operation on the island. With their operation launched at dawn on the 20th of July, 1974, Turkish soldiers saved both Turkish and Greek Cypriots from the darkness of the oppressive regime. Turkish paratroopers were deployed at various points of the island, while fighter jets flew low over the land.
The Turkish armed forces will not open fire as long as they are not fired upon. They are in Cyprus not for war but for peace. They are in Cyprus not for an occupation but to stop an occupation.
The Turkish peace operation in 1974 undoubtedly saved the Turkish Cypriot community from mass extermination, prevented the annexation of Cyprus to Greece, and thus preserved the independence of the island. Following the operation's success, the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus was established in 1975 with Rauf Denktaş elected president. In 1983, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was established.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the top headline from Daily Sabah. Mustafa, as we were talking before, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus marked its 51st anniversary yesterday. Now, Mustafa, how important is TRNC when it comes to the European Union? Tell me about that. There were many problems, there are many problems, and both the Turkish government and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus government both are trying to minimize those problems. Tell me more about that.
Mar, as we mentioned that Turkey and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus have been pushing for two-state solution to the decades-old long dispute on the Cyprus island. On the other hand, we know that Greek Cypriots is pushing for federalism on the island, and they are claiming full sovereignty over the Cyprus island. And in 2004, as you know, European Union accepted Greek Cypriots as the member country, and right now European Union is recognizing full Greek Cypriot sovereignty over the island. But we know that on the ground there are different geopolitical realities. Right now there are two separate nations are living on the island, and Turkish Cypriots are pushing for their legitimate rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. On the other hand, Greek side and Greek Cypriots are trying to block every actions within the European Union in terms of Turkey's accession process to the Union. I think that these actions are poisoning bilateral relationships between Turkey and the European Union, because Turkey and European nations are supposed to address shared security challenges together. But on the other hand, Greek Cypriots are continuing to poison bilateral ties between Turkey and the European Union. I think that if the international community, especially European nations, want to bring stability and prosperity to the Eastern Mediterranean, I think they will be supposed to take Turkey's and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus security demands into the consideration. Otherwise, the bilateral relationships between Turkey and the European Union will be poisoned by the Greek sides and Greek Cypriots.
Also, earlier this year, we saw some Turkic state countries, they decided to recognize the Greek Cypriot administration. Now, how is the TRNC looking at those developments, Mustafa? Because the EU offered those multiple Turkic state countries over $12 billion that will be used to develop their infrastructure and for other projects as well. There are social projects, there are cultural projects as well. So what do you think about that decision, Mustafa? How important is that for the TRNC when it knows that some Turkic state members are not supporting them?
Unfortunately, some Turkic states took diplomatic steps in terms of normalizing their bilateral ties with the Greek Cypriot administration and recognizing the sovereignty of the Greek Cypriots on the island. And it is clearly poisoning bilateral or multilateral relationships among Turkic states. As you know, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is participating in the meeting organized by the Turkic States Organization, and Turkey has been always calling for dialogue and diplomacy in terms of increasing legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the island. Turkey is also urging its allies within the Turkic State Organization to take new steps in terms of recognizing the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. I think that diplomacy and dialogue among Turkic states will be at forefront in the upcoming summits held by the will be held by the Turkish States Organization. I think that Turkic states will be able to find common way or common solution to strengthen unity and solidarity among Turkic states.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you.
You're welcome, Omar.
Now let's take a look at the ongoing developments from the occupied Gaza Strip, and we'll be right back.
At least 67 people were killed by Israeli fire while they waited for UN aid trucks in northern Gaza on Sunday. That's according to the territory's health ministry. The ministry said dozens of people were also wounded in the incident, in one of the highest reported tolls among recent cases in which aid seekers have been killed, including 36 on Saturday. Moihi al-Zaytuna said he was at the Zikim distribution site when soldiers opened fire. He said they raised their hands to show they were unarmed. Then the Israelis started shooting. He said they were only coming for food, not to fight. We just wanted to eat, he said, adding, a man who went to get a bag of flour for his children came back a martyr for his children. The Israeli military said its troops had fired warning shots toward a crowd of thousands in northern Gaza on Sunday to remove what it said was, quote, an immediate threat. It said its initial findings suggested reported casualty figures were inflated, and that it, quote, certainly does not intentionally target humanitarian aid trucks. Gaza's health ministry says Israel's subsequent military assault has killed over 58,000 Palestinians. It has also caused a hunger crisis, internally displaced Gaza's entire population, and prompted accusations of genocide. Much of Gaza has been reduced to a wasteland during more than 21 months of war, and there are fears of famine. Hassan al-Sha'ir is the head of Al-Shifa Medical Complex. He said, quote, people are starving. Signs of malnutrition are starting to appear. Palestinian health officials said hundreds of people could soon die as hospitals were inundated with patients suffering from dizziness and exhaustion due to the scarcity of food and a collapse in aid deliveries. The Gaza Health Ministry said at least 71 children had died of malnutrition during the war, and 60,000 others were suffering from symptoms of malnutrition. The United Nations also said on Sunday that civilians were starving and needed an urgent influx of aid.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the French capital is Mideast political analyst Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi. Dr. Toumi, welcome to the program.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on the program.
Dr. Toumi, let's begin by discussing the recent starvation crisis. How are you looking at the recent numbers, and how are Palestinian communities responding to what's happening in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Frankly, and to be honest with you, it's wordless. I mean, what we have been watching on our TVs and reading on the news, actually print, it's again, I mean, beyond tragedy and catastrophe. So, but this is how the Palestinians have been dealing with these war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, and so on. So all these are under the umbrella of Rome Statute that was initiated in 1998. I mean, the purpose was to stop these atrocities on not only the Palestinians, but on all the people, again, in the world. And we saw this, and the international community is very weak and irrelevant to some extent. And we saw this in our, actually, the last 6 decades also. I mean, with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and then in the Balkans, and to the Rwanda, and now. But what is happening in Gaza Strip is unprecedented in the contemporary history, if not the modern history, of the Muslims, especially the states, because I believe it's the first time when Muslims are surrounded by their brothers, Muslims, and unfortunately those brothers can do anything. He is not, again, and then I'm not speaking about the people, speaking about the Muslim leaders who have been actually in this unbelievable silence, and we don't know, because now, of course, there have been condemnation and speaking out here and there on the media, but there is no action. What the Palestinians today need is actions, and go and tear these wall down and drive through those cross borders and let the Palestinians have a drop of water and a piece of, I won't say meal, but just bread.
Dr. Toumi, what's worse is that European leaders and Western leaders, they're also, refraining from using the word of genocide. And they've been saying that Israel is committing atrocious activities, atrocious acts, but they still haven't used the word genocide. What do you think about that?
But it's too simple. I mean, this is, again, it has been going on for decades, and this is not new, but it was to some extent amplified in light of the Al-Aqsa flood operation on that October 7, 2023, and that we saw how these hypocrites, the Western leaders who, again, popped up like one voice and going and showing this full support for for Israel to go on and commit its genocide. It is, in fact, a genocide, and this is, again, I just stated the Roma Accord, and it is one among the 4 cores of the criteria. Genocide is mentioned. And again, what is shameful of those Europe, especially the European countries, I mean, like France, Italy, Greece, and others, who have signed the Roma Accord, and they are not implementing or at least letting the people to speak up. And we saw how they are silencing the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who has been a voice of the voiceless for the Palestinian people. And she's doing a great job, because what she has been doing, none of the Arab and Muslim leaders dared to challenge the Israel on one hand and its patron, the Americans.
Dr. Toumi, I wanted to ask you, you were mentioning how their Muslim neighbors and they haven't been able to do anything for the Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip, but how can you explain the situation? Because some of these countries are still a part of the Abraham Accords, the UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain. So when you have the Abraham Accords on one hand, and on the other you have support for Palestine, which is lacking, when we talk about Arab states, how would you, join these two together? How is it possible to be a part of the Abraham Accords and then to say that Israel is attacking Palestinians, that it should not do that? What do you think about that?
It's very simple. The Abraham Accords itself, when it was initiated by Donald Trump in his first administration and Israel's prime minister then, it was about to eradicate for good the Palestinian cause and call the Arabs and to come and capitulate. So, and now those people who have, quote unquote, or normalized with Israel, it's not about the Palestinians nor about the integral process of the Arabs in the region. It's about, again, bilateral level and bilateral interests, and that's all. That's all. And this is, again, the aim of this accord are to, one, eradicate for good the Palestinian cause, and then bring the Arabs to the table negotiation and sign the treaty, the 2025 or the 21st century Versailles Treaty.
Dr. Toumi, now Israel has more plans, and these plans are to displace Palestinians from the occupied Gaza Strip. Now there's an area called Deir el-Bala in the occupied Gaza Strip where Israeli ground forces were not present, and they did not attack that area as much as they attacked places like Rafah or, let's say, Gaza City. Now, Dr. Toumi, Israel is planning, it has new plans now to displace Palestinians and to, forcibly displace them to other areas across the occupied Gaza Strip. Now, Israel is in control of 65% of the occupied Gaza Strip. Do you think that these plans will, further enhance Israel's control over the occupied Gaza Strip?
And this is the aim, actually, the strategic objective from day one of the invasion of Gaza on late October 2023. And it's a part to, again, continue in its not only carnage, it's genocide and also ethnic cleansing, and corner the Palestinians or the Palestinians in Gaza and corner them in one spot and just let them leave. But Palestinians have been showing that after 20 months of all these, as you said, it's not atrocities or these acts of genocide are showing their resilience and the resistance. And so they have been fighting with their hands, fingers, and now in these days are fighting with their stomach. And this is why it's a shame on the international community. And actually, by the way, Israel now has totally actually made the international law and international humanitarian law obsolete and caduc, and this make any sense. So, and this is why those leaders, the world leaders, the West, especially the hypocrite leaders in the West, and the Arabs who have been leaders, some of the Arab leaders who have been complicit, and the Muslims have now to show up and to speak up. And by the way, there is this the 80s years of the UN session in September, and they have to look seriously to their to the role of the international law in the international system, or otherwise the UN will be looking like the League of the Nations 79 years ago.
Dr. Toumi, now problems for Benjamin Netanyahu are growing not just at home but also abroad. He's facing ICC arrest warrants, then at home he has to face public protests, and now the collapse of his coalition. So how are you analyzing all of these latest developments surrounding the Israeli Prime Minister?
This makes any sense because he has been, and then the media, especially his media, and leaking this false news here and there, and just to keep, his narrative going to, again, let or have this carte blanche from the U.S. and some leaders in the West, and continue in his genocide on the Palestinians in Gaza. So this is, frankly, it's not news because he knows well, local politics and particularly the American politics. So he continues, sure, they have some, he has some issues with for corruption domestically, and he knows that he has now a minority government, and the end of the legislative session, it is going to be by the end of this month, so he can leave or have this free pass for 3 months until fall. And then, the worst case he will be facing is the fall of his government, and then he will call for early elections. And actually, it's his strongest point in local politics, and also has kind of a pretext to convince the leaders, particularly the current president, the American current president, Donald Trump. And this is, again, frankly, it's not news at all.
Dr. Abdunur Toumi, thank you for that analysis. It was a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar, thank you for being with us in the studios.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.